My name is Veerle Nouwens, and it's an absolute pleasure to chair this first panel with such a distinguished audience. I am the senior research fellow, I should say, for Asia Studies here at RUSI in the International Securities Department, and I also lead the Indo-Pacific program at RUSI. I am delighted to chair this panel on Latin America and great power competition. What is America's place in a changing world order? There are several different areas that I think we're going to try and address in this very short 75 minutes, from how is Latin America being affected by rising great power security competition? What security interests are driving US, China, Russia regional engagement and competition in the region? Is China's military and technological engagement a concern or an opportunity? How can Latin American nations contribute more effectively to global security governance? And what multilateral and national foreign and security policies are needed for Latin American countries to respond effectively to geopolitical events? Joining me today, I have a wonderful set of panelists who will help answer these questions in great detail, no doubt. In order, Dr. Pia Riggirozzi, apologies, I'm going to struggle a little bit today, Professor of Global Development at the University of Southampton. Dr. Vinicius Mariano de Carvalho, the former Director of King's Brazil Institute and the Vice Dean for SSPP at King's. Mr. Juan Batalame, Academic Director at the Argentinian Council of International Relations. And last but not least, Mr. Juan Pablo Toro, Executive Director at Athena Lab. A few housekeeping announcements before we kick off. We'll see that this is, of course, a hybrid event. So we will have a conversational start first, where I ask our fellow panelists a few questions before I open it up to the floor. When we do open it up to the floor, we'll mix between in-audience questions and on iPad questions, and I look forward to figuring out this new technology that we've employed, so bear with me. But if you could, when you do ask a question, speak loud and clear into the microphone so that our online audience can also understand and hear your question and engage with the discussion. And of course, please also note that this entire event, both the answers to the questions and our discussion later, are on the record. Now, to kick us off, I wonder whether I could start with you, Dr. de Carvalho, by asking, will Lula da Silva propose an alternative way of development to challenge the current status quo in the Americas?
First of all, thanks for inviting me and having me here talking to you in this such important event and starting exactly propose more discussions around Latin America. Yes, the election of Lula this year produced a sort of big change in perceptions around Latin America and in the world about the position of Brazil and the role that Brazil will play and is playing globally again. After a few years or 4 years of a government that was more, let's say, shy in international relations, to not use other words, then we have now Lula coming back, trying to play and to perform a more active role globally again. What's important to highlight is what we are calling development here. It's not something new in Lula's speech and proposals of government now. It's some models of development or ideas of development that have been before there in Lula's government as well. So what we saw in the speech is basically, especially in terms of international relations, a sort of repetition of certain values and ideas that were in the previous governments of Lula and his party in general. This focus on Latin America is one of those elements. So Brazil wants to play again an important role in Latin America in the regional governance and demonstrate leadership, what Brazil was not doing in the region as a whole. There are new challenges that probably those policies and that mentality of leadership, or especially the idea of development, are now present and needs to be addressed probably in different manners. I would say especially the question of environmental security And I would say especially this question of how climate change is connected with environmental security in the Latin American region, in particular in South America, on the Amazonian region. Then there are other aspects involved on that, is what certain models of development we think for areas such as Amazon in general. I think it's very important to discuss that, because we may tend to think that we understand development in the same way, but we need to look at a region of like Amazonia and asking ourselves, what means development for this region? I think another important element that it's starting to present as something good, I would say, is the population of this region. They need to have a more active voice in defining policies that are implemented for these regions. So I think Lula has the opportunity now with this new government to give more ownership for indigenous communities, for riverine population that can talk more about what they want for the Amazonian region in general. So I'm focusing quite a lot in the Amazon because I think that's the most urgent aspect that we have now when it comes to think about Latin America in terms of climate change and environmental security. There are other challenges that also are there, and I know that we'll be discussing here with other experts. And one of this is exactly the idea of how the transnational organized crime associated with drug trafficking is becoming almost a parallel economy for the region as well, if not is already. So to look at that, we need to be thinking locally, regionally, and also globally. And in this sense, again, with this changing government in Brazil, we probably have here a good opportunity to rethink how we can look at those issues, rethinking again what we want and understand as development. I would finish with that. We need to think very clearly what we are calling development today for Latin American region.
Excellent. I wonder if I could turn to you, Dr. Pia. You know, in your view, how is Latin America's development path being affected by rising great power security competition? Because of course, we know that development models differ greatly between, say, the West and those being presented by China, for example, as an alternative model. I wonder whether you could comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation. I wanted to start by first celebrating what we heard from the minister today. I think that a level of commitment is needed and celebrated in terms of the new focus that the UK at least is placing on Latin America. So I'm hoping that that level of commitment actually materializes in concrete pathways of impact, particularly in terms of development. Now, whether the UK will take the opportunity to actually lead and perhaps rebrand and revamp that idea of the build back better is a challenge. So I wanted to start with that because I think that's also important in the context of what other institutions are also claiming and calling for in terms of inclusive and sustainable development in Latin America. So, for example, ECLAC has been very strong in terms of calling for a new social pact at different levels of governance, including international governance. So what the social pact will mean in terms of finance, in terms of redistributive and transformative investment is really important. So with those two things, now contextualizing that and going to your question, we know that the region is experiencing dire economic conditions, including high levels of informality in the labor market, high levels of poverty and feminization of poverty. I want to bring that dimension here because it's part of what we need to discuss seriously in all agendas of building back better and investment and development. Feminization of poverty, high levels of inequality, as it was mentioned before, low level of productivity and growth, limited fiscal capacities for these countries to actually respond and redress the many issues that were mentioned as well in terms of challenges to sustainable and just development. So these are issues that are affecting not only in terms of security calculations, security scenarios, but also the rise of citizenship, and democratic governance. So this is kind of the scenario we have in the region. And at the same time, and this is very important as well, the region is facing since 2015 at least, a mass forced migration from Venezuela, which is also placing a lot of challenges in terms of development, not least because many of these Venezuelans, half of which are women, are arriving and trying to settle and looking for protection and looking for rights in border areas that are already poor. So there is something there that needs to be addressed in terms of how we're going to bring that into the security, human rights, and development nexus. In terms of the great power competition in the region, I don't think they are promoting their own interest in terms of addressing those issues that I just mentioned. So that's a problem, and that's a misalignment that we need to think a bit better. Although now China is reopening almost after 30 years of lockdown. So this is perhaps good news for some Latin American countries in terms of perhaps another boom in particular related to commodities. Commodity exporting countries, Chile, Brazil, Bolivia, may see a good prospect there. Although having said that, and I want to bring to closure now, the region has been going through short booms and sudden busts, and that's something that may be also seen in the next cycle. So the two challenges for me are how the international community really is going to create and support conditions for Latin American countries to strengthen democratic governance and sustainable and equitable development, which is not necessarily in the agenda of the three great powers. And more importantly, perhaps, is how is Latin America going to create new instruments for growth that allow competitive, equitable, and sustainable development, which is also a challenge in a country or in the world that is hungry for Latin American food, oil, and minerals. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Comprehensive. Thank you. Mr. Bataleme, I wonder whether I can turn to you, speaking about, countries having their own interests in the region. I wonder in terms of Argentina and how it deals specifically with global power competition. I mean, how do you see such events having an effect, for example, to its South Atlantic policy or perhaps other interests of the country?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's an opportunity, and allow me to speak with you in this morning. I prepared a small speech, and let me address a few points about it. The impact of the competence between the United States and China on Latin America's political and security landscape is a matter of much debate and concern in Latin America. For one group, you have three groups actually. For one group, the rivalry is acute and alarming. It means access to natural resources, creating a technological sphere of influence, gaining political support on the returning to the security dilemma. Choosing one side or another is the only thing that Latin America can do. The trick is to get it right. The problem is choosing now, guessing the future position of the great powers in an international environment, volatile and uncertain. Others want to remain equidistant between China and the US in the security realm, trying to find a comfortable position between the two great powers, avoiding Cold War dynamics and coordinating among countries in the region to sustain neutral security policies. Finally, a small group consider that working around the strategy of selective engagement is the best way forward, especially in the South Atlantic system, even if the security competition is less intense in the area, there is room for security environment degradation in the following years. This strategy encompasses one idea: do business with everyone, but the security agenda should be closely related to the Western world. If we look at the map, Latin America could be divided into the Pacific area related countries and the Atlantic related ones. Those in the Pacific are prone to do business with China. Still, they work closely with the US Southern Command to address low-intensity conflicts, humanitarian problems, climate change, illegal fishing, domestic uprising, and cyber and digital issues related like disinformation. They deploy military capabilities in multinational exercise to maintain policies of free and open navigation, complex operations like distant blockades, or actions necessary to eventually disrupt China's sea lines of communication, as is done in regular exercise like the RIMPAC or Panamax. But China is not the target. The purpose is to maintain strong ties with the US to receive assistance needed to deal with internal problems. The Atlantic area is quite different. In recent years, there has been a growing concern about the scope and speed of trade relations established by China. Still, they fail to penetrate as a major supplier of military assets. Only Bolivia and Venezuela are China's leading customer for military purchases. China is eager to expand its military contacts, but obtained poor results. The only endurable success was in 2011, when they established in Argentina for 50 years a deep space station, estimated a dual capability of the PLA on the chip. They were more successful in the African part of the South Atlantic. Russia was far more successful than China in obtaining military equipment contract, but much less if we consider penetration during the Cold War. Russia located in Venezuela electronic intelligence facilities, adapted runways for the Tupolev bombers, and did some military exercise in the Caribbean, but nothing else. They can increase their military footprint if they want, but I think the situation in Ukraine prevents them from diverting efforts. Let me talk briefly about the Argentine reality. The Argentine reality is quite different. First, it remains weak and is losing military capabilities. The military received funding for equipment under the FONDEF program, which is a new program for military purchases, but those funds are insufficient. The amount is in devaluated Argentine pesos for local production, and it's about subsidized industries, military industries in Argentina. However, there is a loud and sustained defense of the interest in the South Atlantic. Some academics, former military officers, journalists, politicians, and activists consider China and Russia as an option to affect the South Atlantic status quo, which is favorable to the United Kingdom. But I believe they are wrong. That is about your concerns on the potential military engagement with Argentina and technological cooperation and communications infrastructure upgrade. For me, there is not a concern really. If the answer changes to yes, Argentina will compromise its future as an Antarctic country and the stability of the region, with dire consequences to its already damaged economy. Argentina developed one comprehensive strategy in the South Atlantic with one generic approach to reassert and promote its interests in the South Atlantic. The applied logic was one undifferentiated system with one game plan. But in reality, the South Atlantic is fragmented into three parts with different dynamic link among them. The strategy for the territorial waters and the exclusive economic zone must be unilateral, building naval and aerial capabilities as a space for forward defense. But when we look at the ocean as a global common, it requires operating with regional and out-of-the-area partners, making our procedures and equipment as compatible as possible. Multilateralism is needed to solve, or at least to reduce the problem of unregulated, irregular, and illegal fishing, where China, among others, is part of the problem, not the solution, as the activities of the fishing and the ghost fleets appear more frequently in the area. The second sphere is related to the Malvinas and the South Atlantic Island. The relationship between the United Kingdom and Argentina is entangled around the dispute and is the center of the policy in the case of Argentina. Argentina is the weakest part of the equation, even though we have some political capabilities to put pressure on the UK for short periods. Second, Argentina is not the threat, except maybe for some Twitter accounts, if you look at our social network. But we can become a potential one if both countries do not show pragmatic policies. For some Argentinian dogmatic audiences, China and Russia could be a potential partners, providing independent capabilities to be a real threat. That rationality drives the attempt to acquire China's Pakistan F-17 combat aircraft. Still, the reality is that even if we buy those, the Eurofighters based in Mount Pleasant Air Base are much better. They can be a threat to the Saint Helena runway or to the Type 45 destroyer air defenses. So the whole discussion about the Argentinian next military combat aircraft is a fantasy if we want to use them as a way to increase the United Kingdom cost of defending the Malvinas. For us, it will be money wasted. Also, it is a bad option because it will create, once again, the impression about Argentine aggressive behavior in the South Atlantic. If we really want to change the things, we must develop a coherent area denial strategy in the long term, but we can afford it. However, the United Kingdom has some responsibility for sustaining this future vision in some groups in Argentina. The military embargo, the exclusion zone, and the maritime protected areas fits the argument for the so-called British imperialism, which is quite common in Argentina and in South America, to be honest. In the short term, this situation favors the United Kingdom and its territorial presence in the South Atlantic. Still, it doesn't help to look into the future and move forward from the 1982 conflict. In the long term, and if China succeeds in the Pacific quest for hegemony, it will eventually find room to deploy military assets in Argentina. That's why I think we must find a way to maintain a functional status quo, construct a positive and endurable relationship in the security realm to advance common geopolitical interests in the zone, especially if we consider the third part of the system, the Antarctic dynamic. I may stop there and then I refer to the Antarctic later.
Thank you so much. Yes, we'll have much to discuss. Mr. Pablo, do you, in terms of turning to Chile, Chile has, of course, played a pivotal role when it comes to Western countries' security cooperation. Do you see changes to that policy given in the future, given current geopolitical competition?
Well, thanks for the invitation. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, RUSI, for organizing this conference. Well, it's a good question because as Juan told us, I think Latin America is feeling some pressure from China, from US to taking sides. I remember we have this all of discussion about the 5G grid in Chile. Mike Pompeo visited Chile and made strong comments about our decision and basically say, if you choose a Chinese company, Huawei, please, we are not going to share some intelligence with you guys. So there's a strong comment. Then the Minister of Foreign Affairs from China visited Chile and made strong comments too. So that this is not a hypothesis. It's real. But of course, our defense is oriented towards the Western powers. We have strong relationship with the US. We do exercise across the Pacific, and even we were able to send a frigate to be part of a task group, and this frigate went through the Philippine Sea. So the American asking for more of these kind of developments in the near future. So and also, as maybe you know, we have a very strong relationship with the Royal Navy from, I think, 200 years ago. we share a common hero, Lord Cochrane. So with Brazil too, of course.
But you can have it, don't worry.
Yeah, we're happy to. So I think there's no option for Chile to switch sides. We have a de facto alliance with the US and with the UK. We are in this moment, we are increasing our ties with Australia. Australia is a new partner for Chile. is a very ecological partner, which are interest values. We are basically in the same region in the Pacific, facing each other. And now Chile we are going to connect ourselves through the sea with a fiber optic cable to Australia. So it's going to be the first connection with Chile to Asia through Australia and finally through Japan. So, of course, the suppression is a very difficult question. For many countries in the Pacific, I think I'm facing the same question. Now, the US is your main security partner, but China is your main trade partner. Mm-hmm. So, it's a question that somebody from time to time is to ask the kid, who do you love? Your mom or your dad? Yeah, so it's a very tough question, and it's not we don't have it's a very difficult answer. If one day some countries pressure you to choose sides, we are able to manage this relationship in a very smart way, but I think it's time to think more. I think it's time to think more in geopolitical terms. What does it mean in the future? Because the world become very competitive. We're feeling the pressure, as I told you. But I think China have a very strong economic presence in America, in Latin America, in terms of loan, trade, investments. But they can't advance in order to develop a military relationship with some countries. They're not able to sell military equipment. Of course, there's no interoperability between our navies or our air forces or our armies. So I think the engagement in China today is limited to diplomatic or economic ties. But I think they are going to start to press some countries, not Chile, to break their ties with Taiwan. Mm-hmm. I think today 14 countries recognize Taiwan as a country, and 8 of these countries are based in Latin America and the Caribbean. So during the last decade, basically Panama, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, I think another country, Nicaragua, break their ties with Taiwan. And now they're making pressure, they're putting some pressure over Paraguay, Haiti, and Honduras to break the ties with Taiwan. And that is very interesting because in some way, Latin America is very distant from Asia, but we are interconnected with the security dynamics of the Indo-Pacific anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Could I just ask a quick follow-up question on that? And that's maybe to all of you as well. When we talk about security, we've talked about issues like climate change, of course, and we've talked about the kind of high-end platforms, military to military cooperation. But what about other security areas, police and law enforcement cooperation, surveillance technology, digital footprint of China, things that also fall under the banner of economic cooperation. I wonder if any of you could talk a little bit about that and the direction in which you see that going and how that affects the bilateral relationships in the region.
Well, yeah, I think one important aspect to look at that is we normally target China as the actor here. We should remember a few years ago, big scandal when was revealed that US was typing the mobile phone of Dilma Rousseff, the Brazilian president, was really something that it's at least diplomatically unpolite, if nothing more than that. And I think that's an aggression, a real aggression as well to a sovereign state and the sovereign leadership. So I think when we talk about China, we really also need to think about what's the procedures that other actors are doing around. Mm-hmm. And especially in terms of cybersecurity that you mentioned, that's one element of the spectrum of security that we are talking about. We have seen, and we have one expert among us here who leads and thinks a lot about cybersecurity in Latin America. And we can see that we are still need to develop very much a better approach to what we talk as cybersecurity in Latin America. We are still a baby in these terms. That makes the region vulnerable, not only to China, but to the entire planet, to any other actor that wants to explore the vulnerabilities of a cyber environment that is not properly secured. And looking at this as well in perspectives that, is that affecting national security in terms of defense, or is that affecting the public security? So those sort of discussions that Latin America is still very much mixed up a lot. So I think we are in that moment that should be a good moment to try to rephrase and reframe what we are talking as national security for Latin American countries, what we are calling public security in Latin American countries, what sort of threats and challenges intersect and demands us different answers from a more creative or innovative perspective than the traditional ones that we are looking at.
Yeah.
So, okay, military bases, weapons, sale of weapons, etc. It's necessary, it's real. We are seeing that now in the conflict with Russia and Ukraine. It's okay, hardware in war is necessary, but there is another aspect that cannot be neglected. And maybe Latin America is more vulnerable to that than to other sort of threats that we see in global scale in terms of defense and security, because of the specificities of the region as well. And I think we should take into consideration this plurality of Latin America and not look at one single element here. I'm sorry if I'm getting longer, but I promise to finish with this reflection here. I think we need to think about one Latin America that looks to the Pacific, one that looks to the South Atlantic, another one that looks to the Amazonian. It's an inner Latin America, and I'm insisting in the Amazonian as a pan-region that needs to be addressed, the security threats and defense threats as a organic way. We have a Caribbean, we have a Central America that faces both sides, and each one of these regions, they have very specific security and defense threats, interconnected, but need to be seen again as individuals and interconnected. And I stop here.
Does anyone else want to feed into that?
Would like to say just very quickly and just to other different angle as well is I think there is an element of the Chinese presence and the presence of China that also needs to be seen in terms of migration and the hotspots of security that may not relate to what has been mentioned just now, but for example in Central America, in the Darien in particular, we see some criminal activity that has to do with groups of migrants that are stuck there and started to join the cartel, not the cartel, the gangs actually, and the maras that we know in Central America. So that criminal activity is something that started to happen because many of the migrants that we see from Central America and Venezuelans that are stuck in the Darien started to be joined by groups of Chinese migrants. I don't know why. I don't know if those are workers that went for investment or how do we see that? But that is something to look, because Central American countries are hugely affected by violence in that sense, and the maras and the gangs and extortions are actually something to look at.
Absolutely. And I think there's also been some cooperation on kind of tackling transnational organized crime with Chinese criminal groups in Latin America as well. So under the banner of law enforcement cooperation, that's of course, in terms of impacting governance potentially and judicial arrangements, that's potentially another area to look at.
Let me add one thing about the issue on intelligence and cyber in Latin America. In Latin America, we suppose that China and the Americans told us that China is going to spy on us, right? And that is the major problem that we face when we consider to adopt China's cyber equipment, hardware, etc. But we are not certain for sure. What we know certainly that the China's spies on United Kingdom and the US. And also we know by certain that the UK, through the government's communication headquarters and the NSA, spy on Brazil and Argentina. And that was disclosed by Greenwald and a journalist from the United Kingdom with Edward Snowden and 2013, I think, I don't remember, 11, disclosure of the Snowden papers. So for us, the reality is that United States and United Kingdom spy on us, not the Chinese. And that should create another narrative again with the cyber issue on Latin America and create a lot of problems for the Obama administration with Brazil and also with Argentina. And that's the reality. China probably are spying on us, but we do not know. They do not show any paper. We know that. And at some point, because we are cyber dependent countries, as was put it in a report from the IISS, we face one reality. We have to choose who is going to spy on us. Which is a complicated question. If you look at
Not an easy choice, exactly. Did you want to feed into that quickly?
Yeah. I want to, well, I agree with Vinicius about it's very important to focus the debate on security in Latin America and issues as cyber or drug trafficking, because there are real threats. There are real threats, and in that area, maybe we have most in common as countries, because we don't have any capabilities to protect our systems for intrusions from the different countries across the world. And that's an issue. I think Carlos Solar from RUSI developed this topic on a book, in terms of cyber, it's a huge problem. Between the war in Ukraine, the new crisis in Taiwan, people not get notice about this story. But last year, a hacker group based in Russia named Conti attacked the Costa Rican government. It was a ransomware attack and basically paralyzed the Costa Rican government during 2 weeks, asking for money to release the data. I think it was maybe one of the first attack from a hacker group to a government. And finally, this government asked for help from the UK, Spain, Microsoft, Israel, and different countries. And this country helped to help the Costa Rican government to recover data and to start to work again as an effective government. But it was a huge attack. And for me, it was one of the great stories last year in Latin America, and showed how vulnerable our countries are. And we need cooperation from the UK, that's very advanced in that issue, from different countries. Because in this interconnected world with digital economies operating across the world, and as I told you, Chile connecting with other countries, we need to increase our capabilities. And also in terms of the drug trafficking, that is a huge problem. And Latin America exports cocaine to the world for several decades. But it's very interesting how these big transnational criminal organizations as Primer Comando Capital, Chendaragua from Venezuela, the Sinaloa cartel, are opening lines to export cocaine through the Pacific. It's a 14,000 kilometers long line. And also they're importing some chemicals to produce fentanyl that they export to the US. So when we look in the Pacific, we look hard issues, defense, security, the Chinese Navy, the Japanese Navy, that kind of issue. But there's criminal activities across the Indo-Pacific, and I think we're not looking. And of course, AU fishing is a great issue right now in Latin America. And of course, the Chinese fishing fleet is creating some concerns about the region.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
May I jump here? And I just want to go in continuation what we just said about the transnational organized crime. We need to look at that as in the logic of economics as well, because if there is a producer and exports, there is someone buying. And I think we have seen recently an article that our colleague Martin also wrote about this connection with Europe. So there are, if we want to think about security threats related to transnational organized crime, and especially drug trafficking, there is a strong participation of Europe in this criminality cycle as well, because the consumers are here. So drugs are arriving here and being consumed here, as well as in Brazil, in Latin America, etc., and in US. And in many of these bandas or organized crime groups in Latin America, the weapons are not coming from China. Yeah. They are getting US weapons.
State-of-the-art
weapons. Exactly. So if we want to look at that in the impact of geopolitics for the context of security in Latin America, we need to think and talk carefully as well about the role of European countries and the US in feeding some sort of criminal actions and strong actions by those gangs.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I'm just going to look around the room in case there's any questions here before we go into a second round. Yes, Jonathan, actually, and then gentleman here. If you could announce who you are as well and your affiliation.
I think I introduced myself. Jonathan, to our Argentinian friend, I mean, you introduced a very interesting new concept of choosing who spies on you. I can assure you that the Chinese may show an interest in you. It's just that Mr. Greenwald is unlikely to have the documents. But let me just ask a more direct Argentinian domestic political question relating to China, which is how much a security relationship with China is part of the discussion inside Argentina itself. I mean, you mentioned the satellite transmission station, but there is also the lovely Christina's association with a lot of Chinese outfits in her own home state, and the discussion about a potential Chinese naval base in Argentina. So how much is this a subject of a political football game inside Argentina itself?
Well, let me try to address your question in a most honest way. First of all, most of the discussion about the China is on how they can help us economically, how they can give us a loan, give us money. And if you look a detail on the determination of the installation of the space antenna in Neuquén province was under the public discussion, there was no public discussion. It was a concession for 50 years in the darkness for a loan, not even a loan, a swap loan for $11 billion in 2011. That's the first issue that we should consider. The other thing that we should consider that most of the time the Chinese government try to go through the local government to bypass the national government. And that is the way we use ambiguity, because we know that the Chinese can make or can establish some links, some discussion with local officials, not passing through the national officials. And that creates the sense that the Chinese has a more room for operating in Argentina. For example, with the lithium concession from China from Jujuy to China, but also Jujuy made the same deal with Japanese government, for example. So there is an academic discussion. There is some discussion around the military. There is a political discussion there. But if we look at the really who we are as an Argentine in terms of values, in terms of ideas, we are close to the Western world, but we are a poor nation. We do very bad public spending, and we face several constraints in the next 10 to 15 years. And if we look, we talked yesterday about it, if we look the next 10 to 15 years, the Chinese are going to try to exploit our situation in issues related to the South Atlantic. But there is a geographical problem there. They are too far to Argentina. They are fighting for its regional hegemony in the Pacific, which is a fabulous task for them to do it. If they are facing the Americans and also the combined force of the Australia, Japan, maybe India, and of course the United Kingdom. So there is a room there, but it's not a pressing one right now.
Okay, I think we don't have much time for a Q&A left, so I wanted to try and get through as many questions as possible. Sir, second row.
The Guacamaya, which in Mexico, it was the largest cyber attack that they've had, and it revealed about 6 or 7 years of unprocessed documents from the Ministry of Defense, the complete Ministry of Defense documents. This was not state by state, and this was not a criminal gang. This was radical journalists. So there's more than one kind of crypto issue that you might want to consider. And I believe that it also happened to the Ministry of Defense or the defense in Chile and in Colombia.
Peru also.
So who is that question addressed?
Well, for example, Chile.
Okay.
Guacamaya in Chile. Tell us about
Well, of course, this attack was launched by a group called Guacamayas. It's a bird in Latin America. And affect many countries, including Mexico, Peru, Chile, also Colombia. And again, this exposed that we don't have any cybersecurity. But it was focused on emails, basically, and there's not much important information about it. In the case of Mexico, yes, it reveals that some Mexican authorities are spying journalists and activists from NGOs. But in the case of Chile, it's exposed some not very polite comments about the government of some politicians. So, but of course, it reflects what we need to do more about this issue and how we manage our information. But most of the very important information of our armed forces are encrypted. So
Great.
That's not a big problem in Chile, but I think in Mexico too, and even reveal some health condition of the president that people really don't know about it.
I wonder whether we take 3 questions in one round. So the gentleman next to you, and then in the front row, and then the lady in the second row.
Thank you. I'll be quick because I thought you hadn't seen my hand, so I sort of forgot what I was going to ask. But I wanted to ask about the recent events in Brasilia with the storming of Congress and in the broader context of democracy in Latin America, such a dramatic event and the explosive revelation that Brazil actually has a problem with political extremism to that extent and violent extremism. Does it change some of your conceptions about security, about the priorities in the region? I'm thinking here of the way that persistent urban violence and militarization of security policy sort of provokes this tension between governments and civil society, the way that Latin American countries address disinformation, cybersecurity. How does this, do these events in Brasilia and the political instability in Peru, the problem of populism and democracy in Latin America, how can this be sort of, what lessons does it bring to security in Latin America?
Okay, and the gentleman in front of you, could pass the microphone, please.
Hi, my name is Ovais Rajput, defense and security researcher. My question to on the drugs. When we talk about America, cocaine is the whole supplier to the all over the world. when we talk about heroin, Afghanistan and Pakistan, they are coming here. We have from British government perspective point of view, we have DLO in Pakistan, in High Commission, as well as a lot of arrangement in Afghanistan. American General Petraeus also involved there, but so far we failed strategy. Still hard to stop the drugs in UK, and also the third one, synthetic drugs in Eastern Europe, still coming in UK, and we still failed. So lesson how we can in future we can learn from our failures.
And if you could pass the mic just behind you, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the excellent panel. My name is Veerle. I'm a research fellow in the cyber program over here at RUSI. I had a question on the cyber dimension. So I was wondering, right, there's the question of Snowden and how it struck the chords for, having Net Mondial and different initiatives. There's the attack against, the Costa Rican government, the first time that, a state of emergency was declared because of a cyber attack. So I wonder, given this history of increasingly high-level, high-visibility cyber attacks, what will strike the chord of countries in Latin America to actually take it to a political agenda, be it at the regional level and not the technical cooperation at the OAS or other things, but really to insert that as a high-level security priority, which seems to be lacking. So what would actually strike the chord? And if so, what would be the narrative of these countries around the issue of cybersecurity at that level?
Thank you. All right, we've got 5 minutes left, so lightning round.
RUSI,
Yes, there's a few. I think we're going to do just 5 quick answers or quick answers of 5 minutes. I'm sure we have a coffee break after this, so anyone who doesn't get to ask a question, we can discuss it afterwards. Who would like to answer first?
Okay, let me start with the last question. If you look at this, the cyber problem in Latin America, I assume it's the same. Same in the whole region is about bypass that important question. When we look at cyber, we already thought that if Jean Podesta was hacked, everybody can be hacked at some point. And you have to think, first of all, for example, in measures, in counterintelligence measure, how we use information internally, because most of the time, human is as important as OSINT, of course, and also covert operations. So first of all, that is. The second issue, especially in Argentina, if you look at defense, who is going to be in charge of the cybersecurity realm in defense terms? For example, I'm not agree that cyber should be given to the army. We should given to the Air Force or to the Navy, because they are the whole space influence operation, but especially the army in Argentina has a lot of tremendous political power to capture the cybersecurity agenda in order to get more budget. So the problem is budget constraint, I think.
Great. Anybody else? Any of the other questions?
In questions in general. Yeah.
Any reflections?
Yeah, I think I will go to the question of Antonio, because I think it addresses quite directly Brazil, and many people look at that with worries. The first thing I would say is that we should not securitize democracy. Democratic problems should be solved politically and not securitizing it. So if we start to look at that as a problem of security or national security, then we are giving steps back in democratic terms. So I would be very careful and try to put that as an agenda of risk for the security in the region. We have made many mistakes about that in the past, and we should not go back to there. Public and social movements, of course, they need to be civilized in the sense of how to execute their protests and claim their views in democratic manners, but they need to be democratic and not securitized. So I would be very, very against any idea of putting that as a target of risks for our security. It's a smoke, how to say in English, a smoke screen, yeah, removing us to look at what are the serious issues that we face. Cyber is one of those. Borders one of those.
Mm.
Illegal mining is one of those. Environmental security, public security in the sense of connection with drug trafficking, etc. It's another of those. So if we securitize and start to think that the problem is there, then we can very easily fall into traps that will damage our democracy quite strongly.
Other reflections, yeah?
Can I just pick up on that? Sorry, and I think it's a very interesting conversation here. I very much agree with you. The securitization of democracy risks derailing human rights. So that's, and we have seen some of that securitization approach to the management of migration in the northeast of Brazil, and all Operación Acolhida and everything that relates to that has a huge securitized approach that has affected human rights of migrants in many ways, and particularly migrant women. But the other aspect that I wanted to bring to the struggles for democracy, really, and for inclusive democracy, is the developmental angle. And we also have seen how the exploitation of natural resources have led to some social, or the transformation of the social space, affecting the rights of indigenous populations. And so the balance between exploitation of natural resources and what we are going to see in terms of the next scenario, and the human rights of indigenous populations, labor rights, environmental rights, is something that also is going to be a challenge for democracy.
I have permission to extend by 5 minutes. Would you like to give one quick answer?
Just to, I'm giving a short answer because you mentioned the drug issue. Of course, there's a current debate about the drug war in Latin America. It was effective. The US spent millions in combating drug cartels, and of course, there are many countries that are fighting against these juggernauts of crime. They are huge organizations. You can imagine, with tentacles across 40 countries in the world. So there, and now it's very interesting because this debate is not based in universities and think tanks, in NGOs. Now, the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, and the president of Mexico, Manuel López Obrador, they are now asking, this is really working? We need to debate that. What's next? But I know for sure, I lived in Colombia and Mexico many years, so I covered the drug war in the front lines. So I know for sure that Latin America represent, as the minister said, 10% of the world population, Latin America and the Caribbean. But we represent 30% of the homicides in the world. And this is a case of concern, because the drug trafficking is the fuel for any kind of violence in Latin America. So, of course, there's a debate. We need to learn lessons. Well, but we cannot stop fighting these drug cartels. There's a legitimate debate about it, but we need to fight these cartels in some effective way. I think we need to be able to track illegal flows of money across the Latin America and across Europe and across the Indo-Pacific too.
Yeah.
And I think the UK can help us a lot in that issue, because they're very effective tracking flows, illegal flows of money from terrorist groups. So maybe this kind of knowledge applied to cartels and drug lords and drug gangs could be very effective.
3 additional very short questions. I implore you to keep it brief. Gentleman in the middle.
Ewan Grant, I was the old UK Customs Services intelligence analyst for transnational organized crime in the ex-Soviet states. I saw from my time in Ukraine the links with Latin America. Quick question, can the UK be a player alongside Spain in working with you all with these marvelous comments about strategic crime to work more closely with EU central bodies and EU member states who very largely, with honorable exceptions, treat it all
tactically. Let's just look at JBS. There was no attack on Brazil, but there was attack on JBS everywhere else, which tells us a hell of a lot.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you. The lady in the front. Lady in the front, yeah.
Not a question about cyber or drugs. I just wanted to go back to a comment which we didn't return to that Mr. Batalame made about the Antarctic and about a great power competition there. And I'd be really interested to hear what the panelists think, how that's going to play out. Thank you.
Excellent question. And one last question in the back. I apologize, we're going to have to cut it short.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Marcelo. I'm from the Embassy of Brazil. I have a question to Professor Vinicius de Carvalho. Regarding this issue that you brought in your speech regarding environmental security, I'd like to know about your opinion. How should governments debate and discuss this issue in order to avoid that the debate could go to other areas such as trade barriers or even intrusion in internal affairs? And just to point out about this more active voice for the Amazonic regions, President Lula has just created a Ministry of Indigenous People for the first time. The head is an indigenous person. So, and the offer for COP30 in Brazil, in Belém, the Amazon region, is also one issue that they're bringing this more attention to the Amazon and the local people. Thank you.
All right. Quick round of answers, starting with you, and we'll go down the road.
Okay. So your question, Marcelo, is quite, I would need about 3 hours to go in details about that. I would try to do that in 30 seconds. I think, first of all, the question of environmental security is a global question, it's not only a Brazilian one. It will be not one single country with one single policy that will address this issue. And when we talk about Brazil in particular, I think the Amazonian region is on the spot, on the high spot for us. So regional cooperation in definition of policies on how to prevent environmental crimes and assure that the conservation of the rainforest will be in place and the conservation of the natural resource there will be in place are fundamental, this regional cooperation on that matter. It should be also very carefully to not transform that into only a military problem. It is not with the militarization of the response that we will get a security, a protection of the region in general. And again, we need to think a lot, and I said that in my first intervention, what we mean with development for such regions and parts of the world. So what we mean with development, the models of development that we have been in place, especially in industrialized context, proved to be damaging the nature, proved to be saturating natural resource, and connecting to that the question of the Amazon, the Antarctica. So in few years' time, we'll be discussing again the Antarctic Treaty. So what is the view that we are not discussing yet, what we want out of that after these years? I think we need to start to talk right now because it is in the core of any environmental security discussion today, also the future of Antarctica. And I stop here.
Excellent. Over to you.
Well, thanks for putting this issue because I think it's very important. It's very difficult to estimate the dimension of Antarctica because in most of your maps appears in the bottom, a white line in the bottom. Yeah. But Antarctica is bigger than Europe. It's 40 million kilometers square. Europe is about 10 million kilometers square. So it's a huge continent. Yeah. It's full of resources. Everyone knows. In Antarctica, I've been 2 times there, and everyone knows it's full of oil, minerals, whatever you want. But it's today, nobody's thinking to exploit these resources. At least not minerals and oil, but fishes around Antarctica, yes. There are 2 factors that are changing the status quo over Antarctica. One is climate change. You can feel it, you can see it. And then the geopolitical competition. The Chinese are increasing their presence. The Russians are in Antarctica for many, many times. They have many years in Antarctica. But right now, they open a question of what you are going to do with these 2 powers that are revisionist powers. Of course, Russia, they don't respect international laws. We saw what is going on in Ukraine with the invasion. And if we saw what is going on in the South China Sea, we can understand what is the position of China with treaties that, or with international laws. So I think we need to work together, like-minded countries like Argentina, the UK, and Chile, even with our overlap over Antarctica, but we are like-minded anyway, with Australia, New Zealand, and France, and with the US and countries. And we need to reinforce and support the Antarctic Treaty. I think it's the best option to preserve Antarctica as a continent for the world, for the future, because it's very important for climate change. It regulates climate change. So, but it's fascinating what is going on there. We need to pay more attention.
I think we could do an entire panel just on Antarctica, but Dr. Riggirozzi.
Thank you. Just a quick highlight. I think it's very important how particularly Colombia and Brazil are reclaiming the region to address these issues, not necessarily Antarctica, but certainly the environment, health and migration, 3 issues that actually the president of Colombia in the last meeting in CELAC said that are literally the geopolitical cards. So that's not a minor thing, and that's not a very minor point in terms of calling that geopolitical cards. Now, going back to environment, health and migration and the regional platform, even reactivating cooperation such as we have seen in UNASUR before, which actually developed a really complex infrastructure, institutional infrastructure for addressing regional health. We still have the big question of climate change and migration, given that the region failed really to act as a region. So I think that's interesting to look at, and how Colombia and Brazil are going to be leading on those geopolitical cards is to be seen.
Absolutely. And final
Finally,
reflection for you.
yeah, well, thank you. The sovereignty claims are under the Antarctic Treaty, as you know. From a political perspective, the issue is trilateral. For us, it's trilateral because it's of the overlapping sovereignty claim from Chile, United Kingdom, and Argentina. But at the same time, it's multilateral one because of more countries and state and non-state actor plays a role in the continent. For me, it is essential to work together as a geopolitical competition is about the pole. The alternatives involves to develop a zero-sum narrative, which is inconvenient. There is a valid concern about Argentines' ambiguity with China and Russia and how national and local government will react to the Chinese promises on investment under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative. But the dynamics around the Malvinas Islands and the South Atlantic Islands prevent a more sustainable and cooperative engagement with the Western world. For example, that's why we bought Russian support vessel and Russian heavy helicopter to maintain the connection between the two continents. That was our way to show how a cheap alternative and how we can break the United Kingdom sanctions. For me, it was unwise. But if we look at the future, maybe it's going to be a reality between our two countries. That's about the Antarctica. And the last one about the cooperation in transnational issues. If we look at the revolution on big data and small satellites, we are working closely with the United Kingdom in issues like transnational issues. Not all the bilateral agenda is entangled with the Malvinas question, but we should be more, as the poor part of the equation, we should be more smart, and United Kingdom had to find a way to be more receptive in a way to advance into the future. That's why we must develop some kind of functional status quo between both countries, as we already done with Spain, for example. But
yeah.
No, it's okay. And one last question about the comment of the professor, if I may.
Yes.
I'm agree with you, but we should not securitize democracy. But in the post-through era, probably we are going to start to securitizing democracy because the active group that works with some kind of discourse threats our way of life, and they are using by great powers trying to break in our nation. I think it is a good piece, which is the great powers, so the return of the great powers subversion. It's a foreign affair, which is quite amazing.
Food for thought for the coffee break, which we have well eaten into, but thank you to this wonderful panel.